Welcome back, amazing people, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. Today's question: what, if anything, is wrong with America's democracy and our system of government? I know, a loaded question. A lot of us think through this question. You see this question being asked on the right, the left, for everybody from Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump. It's a really interesting question. And we've got on somebody that I could not think of more effectively to be able to speak on than Joshua Graham Lynn, who's the CEO of Represent Us. It's a fascinating conversation. And as always, before we get into the conversation, I'll do a quick little monologue to contextualize that conversation. And if you're new to this, thank you for taking the time to listen. I appreciate all the new people that are joining the Hopeful Majority, because the goal is for us to build this identity of people that are curious, open-minded, those of us that are free thinkers that want to be able to contextualize and understand different issues from different perspectives. And if you've been listening to us from the start, well, keep holding on, because this journey is going to continue to grow because of you. So with that, let's get into the monologue, and then we'll get into the conversation with Josh. Let's cue the intro. So the question that we've got today is, what, if anything, is wrong with our system of government, our democracy? Now, some folks that are listening to this might say, I don't think there's much wrong. I think the way that our democracy is designed, the way that the country's moving, I actually appreciate. A lot of other folks might completely disagree with that perspective. And that's why we're here. That's why we're here to have the conversation. Now, Represent Us and what Josh is doing is focused on trying to figure out how to build a system where they think that the system and our politicians are not responding to the will of the people. Now, the reason I wanted to have this conversation is because if you've been listening to this Hopeful Majority since the start, you'll notice that a lot of the conversations thus far are focused on what I call the cultural aspects of America. How do we have more productive conversations? What is the effect of social media? How do we build a culture in which people are willing to be more curious, more open-minded? How do we actually reward curiosity? And I think those are all really interesting questions. I mean, last week's episode was an episode just by me. It was a solo episode brought to you because of popular demand, where we talked about the Kate Middleton story, the Andrew Huberman story, the tragic Baltimore Bridge collapse, and why all three of these stories that seem to be pretty disconnected demonstrate that we live in this, what I've started calling the outrage industrial complex, this notion that outrage is selling, that we're incentivized. But a lot of people, a lot of you that have been listening to this have started asking the question, well, what about our politicians? What are the incentives that they respond to? How is the system built? And whether you've heard Bernie Sanders say the system is rigged, or you hear Donald Trump talk about draining the swamp, or you hear people talking about the establishment versus the anti-establishment, you hear the words mainstream, there's a lot of other discourse happening around how we're actually designing the structures. And I thought it would be fascinating to have Josh come on to actually talk about his perspective as it relates to corruption, as it relates to influence in politics, as it relates to the way in which our election systems are set up. And the last thing that I'll say before we get into the conversation is that I've started, and I'm sure you've heard this many times, started consuming and have been consuming for about 2 to 3 years all types of different media, from left-wing podcast to right-wing podcast to mainstream media to cable news to reading books from people like Mark Levin to somebody like Stacey Abrams. And you can imagine that the mental gymnastics I've been doing has left my brain to be a massive mush. I don't know what to think in a lot of different elements. And I think that's actually very freeing, because it means that I can try to just ask the right questions. And I appreciate the curiosity and the journey that you've come on with me. But there's a big part of a theme that I have seen across all of these different media platforms and across all the different information that I've been consuming and across all the different political perspectives that we've had on the show, including presidential candidates like Vivek Ramaswamy, or 2020 presidential candidate Andrew Yang, or Marianne Williamson, which is this common theme that a lot of people latch onto about the fact that maybe our political system is not responding to the will of the people. Now, that's a very loaded statement. The will of the people means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. The political system means very different things to very different people. When you say the word establishment, hell, I can't find somebody that can actually define what the establishment means. But there's this general tendency to critique the fact that we've built a system in which people feel that what they're putting in does not necessarily lead to a direct output. That it feels like the people in power might not be representing the people that are putting them into power. And I think it's a real question to explore. And I think this conversation is one of the most favorite conversations I've had this year because it really dives into a lot of different avenues and routes. And we ask a lot of questions that I think both challenge Josh, but also allow him to make really interesting arguments about how we should be thinking about America. And in some ways, we start in the most bridgy way, which is that critiquing America and loving America are actually two sides of the same coin. That patriotism means that we love and that we also critique, because that's what it means to improve. And that's actually how we started the show. So, with that, and with my ramble, I appreciate you listening. Let's get into the conversation with Joshua Graham Lynn.
Hey, Josh, welcome to the Hopeful Majority.
Thanks, Manu. Psyched to be here.
Well, you have to be psyched to be here because you paid a pretty considerable bribe to get on the show. Can you show us how much?
This is coming your way right here, big fat stack.
those are some fat stacks. What
as a political operative,
dollars?
I think you know exactly what to do with this. Yeah, this is it's called a chubby buck, and it's for bribing politicians, and it works great.
It's a chubby buck. So if you're listening to this on Spotify and Apple, but you're not on YouTube, you should get on YouTube really quickly to show what Josh is showing. But essentially, he's got what are $1 million chubby bucks, signaling what it means to have political bribes in our country. I have to ask you, Josh. So I was just on Represent Us's website today, and the first line said, "If politicians won't fix government, we will." Why would politicians not want to fix the government? Like, what's going on?
Oh, what an awesome way to start a question. I think "want to" might be the operative word there. Like, maybe they do want to fix it. Some politicians have certainly shown a propensity to want to come in and say the system is rigged, the system is broken, we've got to fix it. But for the vast majority, the system that we have is the one that put them into power. And so you're asking someone who got into power via the system that they're using, that they've mastered, to get into power and then change that system. And I don't know if you're familiar with the classic tale, Aladdin, but if you think about, like, to find the Aladdin that was actually going to free the genie by using his third wish to set the genie free is a pretty rare thing, which is why it's such a compelling story. And you're basically asking politicians to do the same thing, right? Rub the lamp, get your wishes, but don't use the last one.
Don't use the last one. I have so much to get into. And when we were, for your context, when I was setting up this conversation, I was telling folks about how over the past couple of months, we've been talking a lot about, and have actually had politicians on the show. We had some Republican candidates on. We had some Democratic candidates on. We've got the so-called politicians, and people are wondering, that those amazing people that are listening right now are asking, well, it's great that we're having these conversations, but what are their incentive structures? What are they pointing to? And so I was like, well, who better to talk to than Josh and one of the leading organizations that is actually doing this work. Before we even get into any of that, though, how did you get started in all this? Like, I'm just curious, like, why this?
The thing for me in all of this really is I really like solving complicated issues and making them simple. Like, it's a really big deal to think about fixing the whole entire government, but simply put, like, don't we, the American people, deserve a government that actually represents us, that is accountable to we, the people, regardless of your financial status or your race or skin color, religion? Like, they should be accountable to us. And I think there's a really powerful story to be told there, and something we can do about it. But then thing number two is I am a real pluralist at heart. I just love looking at multiple sides of issues and having open debate and finding things that we can discuss that we don't necessarily agree on. And I think with this one particular issue, like, how do we make democracy work better for all Americans? It's something that the vast majority of people agree on. And so it's a great place to start conversations. And I love that. It's like a really powerful starting place. And it really drew me into working on this particular issue.
So it's a great way to start conversations. I have to say that, my parents are immigrants. So they came from India to the United States in 98, right? And I remember growing up, they would always talk about how corrupt India was. And they always used to say, America's amazing. America's amazing. There's nothing wrong with this place. And when you actually go to immigrant communities, there's this conception that there's really nothing wrong here. And they talk about all the issues that are happening in foreign countries, and we talk about the challenges, but this place seems pristine. Could you tell me a little bit? And I was so curious to ask you this. Like, I never thought about America's corrupt. Like, this idea that you're saying that the government needs to be fixed, it really did not make sense to me for a long time. So Can you tell me why there seems to be this perception? And maybe there isn't. Maybe it's just how I grew up. But I always had this perception that things were great. But you're describing a different reality. Do you see this oftentimes when you're talking to normal people or regular folks, that there is this gap?
Well, I would say I don't often see the gap.
Uh-huh.
I think, but by and large, I think people kind of get that the government is not working for most people. Like there's a lot of concern about that. About 5-6 years ago, a poll went out from MTV of all places asking young people, what do you think of the American government? And the number one word in the word cloud, after they had just, unprompted answers, corrupt was the number one word. When Transparency International and other big organizations do a democracy index study around the world, America's democracy is rated 26th. 26th. Like, that's a lot of other countries that are above us in terms of the functioning of their democracy, and we're going down. So it's not just that we feel that it's unrepresentative, it's that the data shows that when it comes to trust, responsiveness, ability to solve problems, to make people's lives better, our government isn't doing what it should be doing. And the results of that are like, our education system is faltering. Our healthcare system is the most expensive in the world, but with the lowest results in the developed world. Crime may be down, but incarceration is up. And we have all these, so there's all these big problems that we care about that the government doesn't seem to be able to do anything about. And it's because the system itself is broken.
So then why do so many people show up to this place? Why does everybody want to come to America? Like I think about this a lot, and I'm not pushing back. I'm just so like fascinated by that. If you advertised that the United States was the 26th, best democracy in the world, I think most people that look up to this place would be shocked. When I think about this metaphor a lot. You would measure the best restaurant by how big the line is to get in, right?
Sure.
And this place is the biggest line to get in. Why is there then this, this gap between what the United States seems to be objectively by the standards that you're positing, and it seems like a lot of people in the world think differently. Can you explain that a little bit? Maybe this difference between, and the friction between the American dream and the reality of corruption?
Well, I wonder if the reality of what people experience when they're here is everything now that it was 50 years ago in terms of opportunity. I don't know. But something you said actually when we were kind of getting on the call and warming up, look, just because it's a great place doesn't mean it can't be better. America is the land of opportunity, and that is something that we've promised for decades. And so the fact that we have that reputation is not surprising. It's just when you start to compare what we could have to what we have, there's this gap. It's not to say that it's not a fantastic country, because it is. It's an amazing place. I wouldn't live here if it wasn't an amazing place. But when we have so much prosperity, when we have so much promise, let's deliver on that promise. Let's be the number one democracy in the world. Let's have the highest standards of education. Let's have the best healthcare. Let's not be looking to other countries to model how we should do it and then not follow those models. Let's actually have leaders that drive us towards that promise. That would be amazing. And so I think, are we an incredible place for people around the world to come get in line to arrive at? Absolutely. Could we be even better? Definitely.
It's a great place, but it can be better. It reminds me, actually, forget the warm-up call. The first conversation we really had in depth was actually when we were traveling to a conference together. And you mentioned that you actually consider that the divide between being a patriot and critiquing the country should not exist, that actually patriotism involves thinking about how the place can be better. And I can imagine somebody listening to this that heard you talk about the corruption in the United States immediately start to make assumptions about where this conversation is going, and yet you just acknowledge that it's a great place and it can be better. Can you talk a little bit about that conversation we had where you tried to blur the lines between patriotism and critique, and almost articulated this beautiful concept that actually improvement means being patriotic?
Yeah, I think, doesn't love also mean improvement? Like, the things that we love in our life, we want the best for them, for those things. Whether it's your kids and you're encouraging them to do better in school or better in sports or find a better job, get a better life. We all push for that. Our passions in life, our dreams, we push for them. We try to make them everything they can be. And I think to to take that same attitude towards country is patriotism. If you're fine with the fact that America is the 26th democracy in the world, if you're fine with the fact that the services aren't what they should be, then maybe you're not actually that patriotic. Maybe you're disengaged and you're disconnected. And I think that feels to me like not patriotism. Patriotism is wanting the best for the country that we are part of.
Has it always been this bad? Was, as a younger person that is much less seasoned than you are, I'm often told that the 90s were like the peak of Americana. Like that was it. Was it still corrupt then? Like can you tell me what's going on?
Well, okay, so I know not everybody can see, they can just hear. I'm a white guy, I'm a white man. And so have things always been this bad for everyone is a really loaded question. Right? Because America has a long history of disenfranchisement, of treating different groups different ways. And so I think we have to acknowledge that my perspective might be slightly different than others. With that said, I think the America of the past and the far back past was loaded with corruption, but we didn't have the internet. We didn't have as free of a press. We didn't have ways to get information and learn about what's going on. And in fact, America was on a constant growth trajectory, always from its inception. It's been the incredible thing about America. But I think we're experiencing a different kind of disconnect now, where it's not just the smoky backroom deals where somebody's actually being handed a bribe. Like that would be silly because it's illegal. What it is now is super PACs who are raising millions of dollars, working hand in hand with lobbyists to write laws and then make donations to politicians. And then those politicians sort of feel like maybe they owe a favor back to that same group. That kind of dealing has been going on forever. It's just gotten very sophisticated. I wouldn't say it's worse. It's probably better, but it's not where it should be. What do you think about that? Like, is it better?
Yeah. I mean, so it's interesting. There's a little bit of a behind the scenes, but right now my mic is resting upon a recent book that I just purchased called The Tyranny of the Minority. It's a sequel to this other book called How Democracies Die. People might have picked it up or not. I don't know. But I've been thinking a lot about the incentives that are directing the people that are in power. And I've been thinking a lot about the point that you made, which is that it almost feels like there's more corruption now because we see it more, that there's more exposure. Is that essentially what you're getting at? That there is greater exposure, that you actually are lifting the sheets above the bed and you're seeing the bed bugs that have always been there in some way or the other, but now we're actually forced to reckon with it?
I think the gap as I'm seeing it might be slightly different than that. I think what I'm thinking about is we as a nation have come so far in so many ways. And we as a people have an unbelievable capacity to make things better for all of us. Like all of the technology is there. All of the opportunity is there. The wealth is clearly there. The resources are there. And yet we are, as a nation, we're not solving imminent large problems. And I feel like we should be. Whereas maybe in the past.
Why not? Yeah. Why not? Why aren't we?
Why are we not solving the problems?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the incentives thing, right? Like if you get elected into office, you are responsible for fundraising for yourself and for your party from the moment you get into office. You may have gotten into office in a severely gerrymandered district where the only votes that matter are the primary votes, which are only coming from the base. So you're incentivized to serve the base of your party. You might have been elected in a head-to-head competition amongst the more extreme wings of both the left or the right. And so when you come back up for re-election, you're incentivized to stick to those ideas. And so what we have is a system that disincentivizes new ideas, fresh thinking, leaning towards a broader constituency that serves more people. Like these ideas don't work in Washington. And so people in Washington are disincentivized to actually solve problems. Not to mention that the longer they go not solving problems, the more opportunity there is to fundraise, debate, stall, distract, divide the people. It's not profitable, so to speak, to work across the aisle, to compromise, to push forward.
So you might find my next line of question very basic, and yet I can imagine somebody listening to this just wanting to know and dig deeper on why. Like if you had told me 60 years ago that, hey, we're going to set up the system, right, where you're going to have, as you said, immense technology, immense wealth. You're going to be living in a society where opportunity is theoretically abound. And yet the people in power are going to operate in a way in which they don't want to create that reality. I would say, well, why the hell not? Why would you? Why would we get there? So, could you tell me a little bit as to is it human nature? Is it that that there's more money to be made to have a system in which we're not solving those basic problems? I would just imagine that if you're trying to get elected and you're trying to go into office, that theoretically you're there because you might want the best for people. So could you dig into a little bit deeper of why that is?
Yeah, and I'm not sure I have the answer, really. Right? I mean, I can tell you what I see in the data. We know since 2014, Princeton and Northeastern did this incredible study looking at public opinion, issues that people want solved versus the likelihood that Congress was going to pass any laws that would solve those problems. There's effectively zero correlation between what the public wants and what Congress does. Effectively zero. If you're a special interest group, there's a high correlation between what Congress does and what gets done. I think that you sort of asked the question about like profitability. And I think that gets conflated with our members of Congress getting rich, right? Or are people in government getting rich? And that's a whole other debate. There's the behind the scenes, who's making money off of these decisions, which industries might be disrupted, which constituencies win and lose is something that's very dictated by our politics, right? Like our government sets up structures that picks winners and losers sometimes. That's part of modern capitalism with a government. And the people who run that government are incentivized to serve certain constituencies over others every time. And I think that's the place where things aren't getting done. And then to your question about the system that we have, I've heard many political experts say, if you could sit down and design a democracy, a modern democracy for America, this is not the one you would design. Like you just would never draw it this way because we've learned a lot in 200 years, almost 250 years, about how governments can run better than ours does. And yet we haven't put them all into practice.
So that's actually why, Josh, I started this conversation with what might seem like a stubborn perspective of this place seems great. Why are we even critiquing it? Because I think that the conversation oftentimes gets caught up on, if you're positing that the system that we currently have needs to be redesigned, then you must hate this place. And one of the things that we've been starting to do on the show is to try and inject a more nuanced understanding of beliefs that people can at least consider ideas that they might find immediately repulsive. So I would love for the audience to go on a thought experiment with me on where we're going to take this, which is, well, what does that redesign look like? Just a thought experiment, because I don't want this conversation to get caught in Josh is saying we got to redesign the place, so he's a communist. And so let's go there a little bit.
Wait, what's wrong with communism, just for the sake of argument?
Well, that's a great point. That's a great point. It almost sounds like you're like you should be a commodore in the hopeful majority battalions. You know,
there you go.
that are just gonna storm the ramparts.
Yeah, I mean, if we're gonna theorize about different kinds of government, let's start with the one that gets beat up the most.
No, look, Josh, we're gonna be nuanced about all the things that we only want to be nuanced about. So some things are just off limits.
Off limits. You know? I like it. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah. Now, because you pushed me, now we're gonna have to have a communist on next, or maybe, who knows? Maybe you're into it. So
it's not me. Go ahead, find one.
No. Well, okay. I actually want to hold on this for a quick second. So, when you think about systems of government, and you think about the way that ours is designed, and you think about the fact that maybe we do need to go through a redesign. Why do you think there is this impulse that people have to resist this desire to redesign? I see this across the board. I mean, even in organizations, there's this resistance to change, that we've got something, and you saying that we have to change it feels immediately repulsive to me. Why is that?
I don't think that it is. I mean, I would kind of reject the question on this one. My experience has been, when you talk to people about the potential to have a government that is where we don't have gerrymandering anymore, people are like, oh yeah, I hate gerrymandering. Let's not have that. Where political outcomes aren't determined by the biggest donors, Nobody's saying like, actually, I think it's really great that the more money you put into politics, the better representation you get. Like, people don't want that and they're ready to change it. So I actually think that there is a massive, massive number of Americans who want the change, believe in the change. They just don't believe that it's possible, and they may have given up hope. And so my message is like, it is possible. We're doing it. You can see it. If you, as you said before, like if you peel back the curtain and look behind, you will see that state after state after state, year after year, is passing laws that make the government function better, and that those laws affect the federal government. Now, it's slow progress, but it's happening.
And you mentioned that this is an issue that actually starts common ground conversations, because I can right now hear the Bernie Sanders line of the system is rigged, and I can hear the Donald Trump line of drain the swamp. And in essence, both of those do get to a core impulse to try and fix something that people feel is inherently working against them. Do you feel that impulse across the board with people, irrespective of ideology, relatively speaking?
I have a really fun thought experiment for you on this one.
Sure.
I'm gonna recite a quote that I have memorized, and I want you to tell me who said it. Ready?
Okay.
Our movement is about replacing the failed and corrupt political establishment with a new government controlled by you, the American people.
I feel like I should resist your thought experiment so I don't fall into another communist trap, but we'll roll with this. It sounds like Donald Trump to me.
It's Donald Trump, right? But it also sounds like Bernie Sanders.
It does sound like Bernie Sanders.
Right? It also sounds like Represent Us. It sounds like what a lot of people actually really want.
Brilliant.
It was the closing argument to his campaign in 2016. It was the last speech he gave. It was like the rah moment that said, this is what we're all about. And now there's a lot more behind Trump that we should be talking about. And my point is that message resonates wholly across lots of different constituencies. And it's like, I see that everywhere I go. It's a very common feeling that we need to replace this kind of failed, corrupt establishment. It's not something we control anymore, and it should be ours, of, by, and for the people, right? Like, we pay taxes to our government that we run for us, and yet it's been co-opted.
What would you define as the establishment? What is the establishment?
Right, without getting into the like hyperbole of establishment, deep state.
I'm just curious. I'm actually curious because I forget the hyperboles on all sides. I'm just curious because I was actually asked this question at a talk I was giving, and a lot of students actually asked this question of something around the establishment. And there seems to be a new axis of divide in our politics, where it seems to be one of the establishment and people against the establishment. You know, that horseshoe connect between the Bernie folks, let's say, and the Trump folks potentially, right? I'm just sort of rolling with the thought experiment. So could you help me figure out what this establishment thing is?
So I think I would give you two answers that are probably both defensible. And I don't know that either of them is completely right. So there's the establishment, meaning like the depths of government and the way we do things and all of the norms and policies and the complexity of the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of government employees. Like, there is an establishment of government. There's also the establishment that I think is more like in that Trump quote, which is the establishment meaning the government that we have that is responsive to multinational corporations or to special interest groups that have massive amounts of power, or party apparatus, right? Like the DNC and the RNC have multi-billion-dollar war chests that they use and deploy, and that they demand fealty from their candidates in order to get access to. It's that establishment that is not we, the American people. And I think that's the one that we should be pushing back against.
So, you know, we've had a couple of interesting guests that resonate with me on this specific point. So we had Andrew Yang, who's, somebody that both of us mutually know well. And then we had Vivek Ramaswamy. And obviously not drawing an equivalency between both of them in either way. But one thing that was common, what both of them were talking about, was your point right there of the second establishment, the latter piece, that the apparatus, especially as it relates to the party structures, are one in which feels like people are generally pushed aside, and it's much more about interest. And then the second question we get as we go on this thought experiment that people often ask is, well, is it like a few people in a room that are like deciding and making all these decisions? Is it just like the momentum of the system? I'm just trying to think about if I was like running, if the US government was a company, which is a terrible way to analogize it, but let's say it was. And is it some people that are saying we should be doing this? It's like it goes down that rabbit hole, but I'm just curious on how you think through that and the normal person asking that question.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of thinking in my career about systems in general.
Yeah.
For a long time in like the early 2000s, systems thinking and design thinking was like a thing, right? A real buzzword. And I was younger then. The thing about systems is that systems by their very nature protect themselves. Regardless of a person or an input, there's like an inertia that happens with a system. And so in order to change that system, you have to actually dig past the inputs and outputs of it and go to the root of what is causing the system to act that way, which we can get into in a minute. But when I think of like the political system, I believe that there are actors who likely have the power to give the genie its freedom. Very few, right? Like certain presidents may have the power. Certain speakers of the House or Senate may have the power. But by and large, they're pushing against an entire system. And the very nature of systems is that systems protect themselves. I think Obama is a great example of this, actually, where we could look back and have a conversation in history about like, were his policies good? Were they bad? What happened? What didn't? But by and large, even the Obama campaign came from this place of the influence of money and lobbying in Washington is pernicious and it needs to be stopped. And yet, even though he had alignment in all three houses, was unable to fundamentally change the system and the way it worked. They put some new rules in place, but did not fundamentally change it in the image that he had described. And that happens over and over again. Lucy and Charlie Brown with the football, right? It's that. It's like we keep looking to a person to fix it. And I just don't think that that's the answer. Like not one person is responsible and not one person is going to fix it.
So then, I mean, you said it. Let's go to how you actually fix the system. Carte blanche. What's sort of your thought and thinking around this? Because you've obviously thought very deeply about how to break that cycle.
Yeah. So I have some brand new thinking around this that I just got exposed to a few days ago that really excited me. But the straightforward answer is if you want to change the system, you have to change the rules of the system, right? And the rules of our system are laws. They were just designed by a group of people, written down on paper, and we follow them. And that's great because we want to follow our rules. The law should be sanctified. But if you really want to change a system, it's not enough to just change the rules of that system because we are a society and we are people and we are humans, and humans react to rules, but rules don't define us in how we are. So if you want to actually change the system, you also have to change the culture that keeps that system in place. And this is what was really exciting to me about I don't remember the name of the author, but I was just reading about systems change again. And what it fundamentally comes down to is if you want to change something as big as our governmental system, you actually have to change the culture of America to believe in a different kind of system. We have to want a system where we are in control, where we have power, where divisiveness is frowned upon and unity and compromise are celebrated. And so I'll pause there before getting back on my soapbox, but these are the ideas that I think really change things. Change the rules and change the culture, and now you're off and running.
No, keep going. So change the rules, change the culture. The piece that you said just there at the end, that you change the culture to build a place in which people want a government that they can actually control is a sentiment that I hear on the right, the left. I do the equivalent of mental gymnastics, and I basically consume right-wing media, left-wing media, podcasts. I don't even know what to think anymore, but the one thing I can say is that sentiment is through the roof. So could you go there further? How do you change the culture? And also, how do you make it such that it actually does span ideological lines? Because I think you've said that would be the key to fixing it.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples of defining a culture is the company Harley Davidson. You've brought up some, like, what if it was a company? The amazing thing about Harley is that their people who own Harleys will tattoo the logo of the corporation on their body. They like, it is that deeply ingrained as a cultural statement. Like, I own a Harley, and that's not actually what it says. What it says is, I believe in freedom. I'm a badass. I'm an accountant by day, but I'm a party animal at night, and that's why I have this tattoo. The reason that Harley brand stands for something is that is the narrative and story that they have built, right? Like, other motorcycle brands don't stand for that. And you can make the same case around America. It is the stories we tell. It is the stories that our leaders tell us. It is the media environment we live in. Here's another fun thought experiment I like to ask people all the time, which is,
Sure.
do you drink, I'm sure you're probably not a soda drinker, but if you were a soda drinker, Coke or Pepsi?
Pepsi.
Pepsi. See, I think Pepsi drinkers are disgusting. Like, I just think it's gross. And the reason I think that is because I've probably seen more Coke ads than Pepsi ads, right? And I bought into whatever the narrative was. It has nothing to do with, like, do I like the taste of it better? It's all about association. Do you want to push back on that? I feel like you want to push back on the Coke Pepsi.
No, I was going to say now it means that we're fundamentally evil as well, and we're opposed, and you obviously are a terrible human being.
That's right.
And
right.
And I'm curious, actually, when you bring up this Coke and Pepsi example. So it's interesting that you say that they've built a culture in which, and I can imagine also Coke advertising. I mean, I've seen the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s. It was prolific. Pepsi seemed to be much more of a global thing, but Coke was here domestically. What do you think they figured out right about labeling a culture in a certain way? Or you mentioned Harley, right? Like, what do you think they're doing well? How do they define that narrative? How do they tell that story in a way that appeals to the people that they want to appeal to?
What an awesome question. I think the fundamental insight is that cultures that succeed, whether they're built around a religion or a company or a country, those cultures create in-groups and out-groups. Right? We are designed as humans to believe in tribes, and there's not always something wrong with that. I know tribe has been a word that's sort of vilified in politics, but we can build a culture in which the in-group is people who are willing to disagree, and that is celebrated, and that taking in various kinds of media is part of the norm, and it's the thing that we look to as, like, wow, Manu really is, like, exemplary of what it means to be an American, because he's looking past party lines and living above. He's not a Democrat or Republican. He's a free thinker. He's a solutionist.
He's just enlightened. He's enlightened beyond doubt.
And very handsome.
Thank you. Thank
you. Yeah. And so, like, that's the in-group that we want, right? And so I think what these brands do in an incredible way is they find ways to create an in-group around the thing that they've built. The most famous brands do. And I see the opportunity for America to have the same thing, and not have it be the in-group is Democrat or Republican, but that there is another in-group that is about something much bigger and better that we've been talking about here.
Can I share something with you on this?
So
the reason why we actually created the hopeful majority, and it's separate from Bridge USA from a branding standpoint. Most people don't know the connection. A lot of the people that are listening to this probably have no idea that I actually do something else as well on the side. And yet the idea behind the hopeful majority was that in some ways, somebody like Nixon built the silent majority, which I thought was an interesting in-group identity that spoke to a certain kind of people. Newt Gingrich and the Republicans in the 90s had the moral majority, and the idea they're building an in-group around religion and Christianity. And the thought process here was that, to your point, that most people, I think, are out there in the world who want to disagree, who want to listen, who are generally curious, who just want people to solve their damn problems. And it's good to have groups, and you want to build an identity around that group. And so this is like my first failed attempt at basically getting people together and being like, here's an identity that we can start building. But here's my question is, it feels like you need a lot of resources to build an identity. It feels like you need a big microphone, a microphone that's louder than the other identities and the other groups. And it also feels like you need political leaders to pick up the cause of your identity. And yet we live at this moment where any politician that touches anything immediately gets poisoned as that person's thing. So how do you, given sort of at least my like very initial assessment of the problem, think about building an identity from your standpoint?
Awesome questions. I'm not sure that you need the most money to have an identity. I'm not sure that you need the most politicians. I'm not sure that you need any politicians, honestly. I think there's an old adage that I'm about to screw up, but like there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. Right? That's the phrase,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. And I think
I'm the wrong person to be asking, but it sounds smart.
it sounds really good. I'll pretend I made it up.
Just say it's yours.
It's mine. It's mine now. But yeah, I think that you can have in groups around all sorts of things, and people get very highly affiliated with those things, right? Like people go to knitting clubs and movie nights and associate with all sorts of stuff, whether it's Burning Man or church. Like in groups get created, and it is by finding the people who feel the way that we do, sharing ideas and commitment, and then sticking to it, that identity grows. Might take time. Money would probably make it go faster. I would like to ask you a question.
Yeah, please.
Hopeful majority. What does hopeful mean to you?
I think that's actually part of the reasoning behind it. Is I think hope means something different to everybody, but my conception of hope, which is different than optimism, is the notion that if you put something into it, you will have progress. And it being whatever the case might be. I think that the notion of hope, at least for me, is this sense that my action leads to a reaction, and that I actually have the capacity to influence something around me, whether it's my relationships, whether it's my friendships, whether it's the political system. So that's at least how I think about hope. I'm curious what you think. Yeah.
I actually love that description, because remember before I was saying, I think that one of the biggest problems is people want a different system. They just don't believe it's possible. And so we look to a singular leader to try to fix it, because that's where we put our hope. And I think your definition of hope in saying that it's this belief that if I put in an input, there will be an output. The thing that I most want people to hear from me is that is possible. And we have to, as an American country, we have to recognize our own power as people to improve our government, our political system, and the way that it functions. Because that hope it's not false hope. It's actually real hope, and it can work. And so I think that you're very wise to have that output. And I hope more people get on board with your religion, with your dogma. It's a good one.
With my cult. I
didn't say cult, but
and as any great cult leader would say, this is actually your cult. You're in charge.
Exactly.
I'm just shepherding.
I'm just the messenger. I'm like a conduit from a higher power delivering this message to you.
There's one piece of this conversation that I don't want to leave behind, which is actually what you are proposing through Represent Us to make it so that the inputs actually lead to outputs. Because we've talked about culture, right? That was I guess pillar 2 of what you'd posited, and then you'd said pillar 1 was actually changing the rules, right? So that that not only are we telling people to be hopeful, but we're also actually showing, at least from your standpoint, that the way in which you're tinkering with the system allows you to get there. So could you go a little bit into how you're actually changing the rules? So sort of pillar 1 of that theory of change?
Yeah. So we Represent Us as building a movement of people all over the country that are working across party lines to pass new laws in cities and states that make the government more representative of the people. In a nutshell, that's what we do. And the kinds of laws that people are passing to make the government work for the people is a broad range. So some great examples that we've seen through watching what happens across this movement are when you put an independent commission in place to draw voting districts, instead of letting politicians do it, you get better, fairer, more representative elections, and you have less gerrymandering. Or you have districts drawn that engender competition and don't just give the entire state to one party or the other. And that works. It's not a perfect solution. It works. There are states that are now looking at multi-member districts or proportional representation. These are also new ideas that I hope will gain traction, and we will see our movement work on them. So that's the gerrymandering bucket. When we look at the influence of money in politics, the corruption that we've talked about, you can pass laws that say, if you're a lobbyist, that's a really good thing. You should lobby for something you believe in, and you can get paid to be a lobbyist. But you shouldn't then be able to make a political contribution to the same politician that you're lobbying to pass a law. That's very clearly a conflict of interest or corruption or bribery, right? And you can pass a law that just makes that illegal. And what most people don't know is that right now it's totally legal in a lot of places. But we've seen regular people get together, put their minds to it, and get laws passed to crack down on that corruption. We could have a system of voting where independents and third parties can run without spoiling elections. And so whether that's ranked choice voting or another system, doesn't matter. It's that we see people passing these laws, and the outcome is like what we saw in Alaska, for instance, where you have Mary Peltola winning an election where it was her and two Republicans. And those Republicans could run against each other without spoiling the election for each other. On the other side of the ticket, Lisa Murkowski won as a very moderate Republican because she wasn't able to be primaried. And so you start to see that you change these laws and you get very different outcomes. And we see it all over the country.
So the idea is that you've got these three buckets of gerrymandering, you've got a bucket of influence in politics around money, and then you've got a bucket of making sort of elections more representative.
Yeah.
I can imagine somebody that's listening to this right now saying, well, all that sounds great to me. I mean, it's really hard to poke holes in that. And oftentimes when we get into the policies or somebody's presenting an agenda, like Vivek talked about gutting the entire FBI,
that's a really tough equivalency that you just drew there.
Yeah, you talked about influence in politics, and he said let's get rid of 75%. And do you know how he said he would do it?
No.
You know what the solution was? That you give every federal bureaucrat a number of 0 and 1, and then if you pick a 1, you're out.
It's like the ring. It's like you know what I mean? Like Thanos' glove.
Yes, Thanos' glove. But no, the reason why I bring this up is because I normally don't like to get into the actual weeds of the policy. I like people to present their ideas and then let the audience consume it and say that this is an idea that somebody's presented. Think through this, and here are resources you can go to learn more. So, but the question I want to ask you, actually, because it's hard for me to think about the counter arguments to some of the things you said, is what do you think the biggest critics, or like, what do you think is the strongest critique against the agenda that you've just outlined is? What do the critics, I guess, point at, or what are the critiques that keep you up at night that you're like, you know what, that actually is a real argument that we should consider?
Yeah, it's funny. I had another conversation with somebody else in our network, and they asked a very similar question. I think it's an awesome thought experiment. What I can tell you is, like, part of my job is politics, so we hear the critique all the time. Like, there's always some counter argument, and I think the important question, I'll get to it, but like, I think the important question is who is making the counter argument and why? Like, why are they? What is the incentive they have to fight back against this law? So. I've never heard a good argument for why lobbyists should be able to bundle millions of dollars to give to politicians while they're also lobbying that politician to pass a law. Like, I've heard arguments, which is like, well, it's free speech and money is free speech, and so they should be able to do whatever they want. But like, that's kind of an absurd argument when you recognize that the output is you're handing politicians campaign money to keep them in power to pass your laws. So we hear that a lot, the free speech argument. And I think that you can be a ferocious advocate of free speech and also see that it doesn't really apply here. We hear what I would say is a very silly argument around making things more difficult for voters when we talk about changing how elections work. Like, oh, if you have more choices, it's going to be so hard for people to choose which of 3 candidates they like. It's much easier for them to choose from 2. So we hear that, that it can be confusing. But again, that's not what the data shows. It's just it's an argument from people who don't want to see the system changed. And then here's some really valid arguments, though. I think when these arguments don't come from our opposition. They come from allies and supporters who want to see change, but want to see it done in a very thoughtful way. And so a great example.
Interesting.
A great example is if you think about gerrymandering, which is a pretty easy one, right? We draw districts to say who gets to vote in which election where. And if you change those districts, you can change the outcome of an election. And so politicians have an incentive to draw lines that benefit them. And so we can say, get rid of that. Like, we don't want that. But there are provisions that were in the Voting Rights Act that have been fought for decades to protect communities of color that are minority communities, to make sure that they do have a representative voice. And district lines have been used in the past to protect those communities, to give them a voice, to actually give them a district where they have power and therefore they get a representative in Congress. And so there is a risk that if you change laws without being thoughtful of the various communities that will be affected, you could inadvertently undo something that was very rightfully done. And I think that's a really, really, it's not a critique per se, but it's a really bit of sage advice where it's like, if you're going to do this, you need to be thinking about the various constituencies that will be affected and make sure that they are also better represented. Does that track? It does.
It's that there's a couple of key, it's not even critiques, but it's a couple of key considerations to think about.
Right.
But it's interesting actually that you answered. It's a unique way. I haven't heard this answer before, which is that it actually matters who's making the critique, right, and why they're making it. I want to actually go down this line really quickly and ask you from the conservative perspective, and specifically, let's say from the Donald Trump perspective and the populist right standpoint, where I hear a lot of this. And one of the things that I think about is the general skepticism I hold about the way that our election systems are built. I feel skepticism about those in power and how they're meddling in our daily lives. And it feels like the rules are built in a way in which my voice is not going to prevail. How can I trust you to build a set of rules that would actually also feature my voice in that system?
Yeah. I mean, I would say don't trust me, first of all, because these aren't
you're not the cult leader.
I'm not a political scientist. I mean,
well, is it really a science?
It's your cult. It's your cult. Is it really a science? Yes. I mean, it really is a science where you can study countries and cities and states around the world, or provinces, however you want to say it. But, and you can find that certain forms of elections and governance are more representative than others. So that's the data is there.
Yeah.
There you go. So you probably know better than I. But I'm gonna actually just use the same framework that I brought up a minute ago. Is what is the motivation? What is the incentive? And I think Donald Trump is a perfectly fair example. He's running for president, so we should probably be able to talk about him. It is pretty clear to me as an observer that Trump is someone who sees himself as the conduit of power that will deliver the results that he's promising, right? Like, it's put me in power and I will do this for you. And if you don't believe that, you probably don't want to vote for him. And if you do believe that, you might want to vote for him. And that's everybody's personal business. But that's not at all what I'm suggesting. This is about, if you have a system that is more fair, more equitable, more competitive, where the voice of the people takes preeminence, it becomes much less about any one politician and what they will do. And it becomes much more about, you've actually built a system where all of us, we the American people, actually have control because the system allows it. And the simplest metaphor is like, if you're into sports, if you have two football teams playing and one team gets to draw all the lines, bribe the ref, decide how big the goalposts are, like, that's not fair to the other team. You want an impartial judge and jury. You want an impartial government. You want impartial elections. That all has to be baked into the system.
Yeah. It's so interesting that the way in which you're thinking about the system is a way in which you're essentially trying to build a world where people's input leads to output, but also that there is a real incentive structure where political people feel like they can actually act for everyday people. And I think there's a lot there. And if I'm listening to this, where can I learn more about the work that you just explained? Where can I find Represent Us? How do I learn more about some of the stuff that you're building?
Yeah, so represent.us is our website. go there, check it out, sign up, represent.us. And if you're really interested in getting involved, we have a program that can help you do anything from like click and send an email and send letters in support of campaigns that need help right now. We also do in-state organizing and trainings for potential leaders who want to learn about what I'm talking about and learn how to activate locally. And if you're already involved in a campaign somewhere and you need help, please go to the website or just call us, get in touch with us through the website, because we do hands-on training with and coaching with active campaigns. And so at every level, from like a $1 donor all the way up to somebody's hands-on with a campaign, there's a way for you to get involved. And I think it's really important that people do get involved.
And if folks listen to this and they found areas where they want to learn more, they feel like they have curiosities or critiques, that's also where you can find a lot of that information. I want to end on this. This is a question that I ask everybody, and it's about what your why is. And the reason why I ask this question is because I'm always curious to learn about what drives and motivates people, because I think that that allows you to, that's a precondition for hope, at least the way that I think about it. And so I'm just curious, what is your why, and why do you care so much about building this culture and changing the rules in a way that you think represent everyday people?
Yeah. It ties back to what I said at the start, which is this idea that I don't believe that one set of people or one politician or one side of the aisle has all of the right answers. I just don't believe it. I see a lot of nuance in even the most complicated issues that we can all discuss, either between the two of us or as a nation. There's just a lot of in between. And I think if you really pride honesty and empathy and seeing other people for what they intend to put into the world, you can find a lot of opportunity to learn from them and to share ideas. And so I see that, and then I see the world in which my two daughters are growing up in. And nearly everything that I just described is vilified by our political system. And it's vilified by much of our culture, right? You're supposed to have a strong opinion about something. If somebody doesn't agree with you, they're the enemy. Grab your power, take it, keep it. And I just don't see the world that way. And so it's very motivating for me to think about building something that could have lasting impact to leave a better nation for my kids and your kids when you have them. But also to do so in such a way that truly inspires a new way of thinking in this country that I believe is much more aligned with the promise that's in our Constitution: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, like of by and for the people. That stuff resonates because it should, and yet it's not the democracy we have.
Josh, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for your time. Thank you for educating us. Thank you for everybody for listening. And I really appreciate you articulating some of this work in a way that is accessible. So thank you.
Thank you, Manu. I really appreciate the thoughtful questions, the pushback, the ability to consider things from both sides. It's just been a total pleasure.
Thank you so much to Josh for coming on The Hopeful Majority. I appreciate everybody that's listened to this conversation. I'm sure that you listened to parts of it where you really agreed. I'm sure you listened to some parts of it where you really disagreed. I'm sure there are parts of this conversation where you said, wow, that was really insightful. Well, if that was the case, that's the point. That's exactly the point. The reason why we're building this Hopeful Majority is because we're trying to bring together people of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different ideas, who all believe in this temperament of curiosity, of listening, of willing to understand. And if that describes you, then keep building this Hopeful Majority with me. We need to build this together, because ultimately we need to start elevating nuance and start deprioritizing outrage. Because out there, what sells is us making quick takes and listening to the first thing we see. What doesn't sell, what doesn't elevate, is nuanced thinking. And that's what the Hopeful Majority in the show is about. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're on Spotify, Apple, please leave a review. It builds a Hopeful Majority. You and I together. I'll see you next week.